faithfully sharing value and interpreting great books worldwide. Hi, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today, I'm interpreting a book called Obedience to Authority for you. Its author, Stanley Milgram, was a famous American psychologist, and this book documents a series of obedience experiments he conducted in the 1960s. This experiment has been extremely influential, even revolutionary, in the history of psychology and social sciences, because it revealed a deep-rooted psychological phenomenon. People not only obey authority, but also blindly follow it against their conscience. Like many psychologists in the 1960s, Milgram was deeply puzzled by a phenomenon: Nazi Germany's massacre of millions of European Jews during World War II. He believed that these inhumane policies might have started as just Hitler's idea, that without many people obeying orders, these policies couldn't have been implemented on a large scale. While studying the Holocaust, Milgram noticed an interesting thing. Ordinary people were ordered to kill, and they did it because they felt obeying was their duty. In the post-Tupiwo Nuremberg trials, many war criminals kept saying, "I had no personal grudge against these Jews. I was just carrying out orders from my leaders." So Milgram wondered, could obeying authorities' commands really turn a normal person into a murderer? If their conscience told them harming others was wrong, why didn't they resist? With these questions, from 1960 to 1963, Milgram and his team at Yale University ran a series of obedience experiments to see how far people would obey authority. So, since these experiments involved electric shocks, they're often called the Milgram shock experiments. In this book, Obedience to Authority, Milgram not only fully recorded the experiment process, but also deeply analyzed the results. Next, I'll guide you through Milgram's obedience experiments in 4 parts. First, how was the obedience experiment conducted, and what were the results? Second, what are the reasons people obey authority? Third, what factors influence the experiment's results? Fourth, why can some people resist authority while others can't? All right, for the first part, let's take a look at how Milgram's obedience experiment was conducted. The experiment team. First, they recruited men aged between 20 and 50 in New Haven, where Yale University is located, to participate in this experiment. When the participant arrived at Yale's lab, they would meet 2 people. One was a lab staff member who appeared to be a scientist, and the other was a 47-year-old accountant. The staff member told him that the accountant was also participating in the experiment. They would need to play roles in this experiment. One is the teacher and the other as the student, with the teacher conducting memory training for the student. As for who would play the teacher or the student, it was decided by drawing lots. However, all of this was actually fake. The truth was that both the staff member and the accountant were trained actors. The entire experiment was focused solely on the participant. No matter how the lots were drawn, he would always draw the teacher role. Then, the game began. He and the actor playing the student were taken to a room with an electric shock device. The shock panel had 30 switches, each corresponding to a voltage level, ranging from the lowest at 15 volts on the left to the highest at 450 volts on the right. If shocked at 15 volts, it's similar to a slight prick, like being lightly poked with a needle, without much sensation. And we know that the standard household AC voltage in China is 220 volts. If electrocuted, that can already be lethal, and 450 volts would definitely kill a person. The experimenters had the participant stay in this room while the student went to another room opposite. If the student answered correctly, they passed and moved to the next round. If answered incorrectly, the teacher had to press the corresponding button on the shock panel to administer punishment to the student. So, we for the first wrong answer, the student received a 15-volt shock. For the second wrong answer, they got a 30-volt shock. Each wrong answer required increasing the punishment up to the maximum of 450 volts. And so the preparation was complete. Everyone in position, the experiment begins. During the experiment, the student would have many questions. Unable to answer questions, the teacher administered punishment, increasing in intensity from 15 volts to 110 volts to 220 volts. As the voltage increased, the student would let out agonizing screams and pleas, even making sounds like they were on the brink of death. And the participant in their own room could hear all these sounds clearly. So, how would the participant react at this point? Would they immediately refuse to continue the experiment or follow the experimenter's instructions to keep punishing the student? Some participants showed increasing discomfort and unease as the voltage rose. Others initially laughed when hearing the student's screams, laughing louder and louder. But almost everyone at some point asked the staff whether the experiment should continue, with some outright refusing to go on. Actually, the experimenters had anticipated this situation and prepared responses in advance. For example, the experiment requires you to continue. You have no choice. You must go on. The experimenter would urge the participant 4 times consecutively, only allowing termination if the participant refused a 5th time. Milgram's obedience experiments actually consisted of a series of studies. What we just described was one of the baseline experiments. In this scenario, the participant played the obedient role, while the staff member acted as the authority figure, giving commands to see how far the participant would go despite the student's screams. There were 40 participants in this baseline experiment, and 25 of them, that's 62.5%, administered the maximum 450-volt shock. Building on this experiment, Milgram altered some procedures and settings to observe how obedience behavior differed under various circumstances. He conducted 19 such obedience experiments with over 1,000 participants, showing significant variations. In some experiment groups, up to 92.5% of participants administered the 450-volt shock, while in other groups, no one administered the maximum voltage shock. So, why do people have this tendency to obey authority? This brings us to the second part I'll discuss next. Milgram believed this relates to human survival patterns. To survive, people must organize and live collectively, but individual differences are vast. Everyone has different desires. So, how can we get people to restrain their desires, cooperate, and live together in this world? On one hand, of course, moral conscience developed during civilization's progress. These ethical requirements constrain people's behavior by establishing moral norms. Another method is setting up an external authority to control your desires, forming a hierarchical structure. Within this hierarchy, those at higher levels can issue commands to those below, ordering you to perform tasks. Establishing such an authority has 2 advantages. It unifies action among differing opinions and improves efficiency. Otherwise, you might want this, I might want that, and ultimately nothing gets accomplished. For example, in the military, subordinates must surrender control to superior officers, ensuring unity against the enemy. When someone surrenders their decision-making power, Milgram believed they enter an agentic state. People in an agentic state allow others to make decisions for them and issue commands. And at this point, your behavior patterns may shift, your moral conscience might stop functioning as others decide what's right or wrong for you. Like in this experiment, participants viewed the staff member as the authority. So since the staff member ordered me to punish the student opposite, I did it. Though internally unwilling, I had no right to decide. I just followed the staff's instructions. This raises the question, why would people suddenly relinquish decision-making power, letting others dictate their actions? There are 2 reasons. One is our upbringing, conditioning us from childhood to obey authority. For example, parents tell children, don't fight with other kids at school. When parents say this, it implies two things: treating others politely and obeying me. To make us obey willingly, authorities design comprehensive reward punishment systems. For instance, disobedience gets you spanked, while obedience earns praise or treats. In a company, if you disobey your boss's orders, they can deduct your salary or fire you. Through these reward punishment systems, you learn that obedience benefits you, while disobedience carries unpredictable consequences. The second reason driving our obedience to authority involves specific environmental factors. For example, seeing doctors and nurses in uniforms at hospitals makes you perceive them as having professional expertise. Regarding health issues, they're authorities, just like police uniforms signal law enforcers who protect your safety. In Milgram's obedience experiments, researchers designed environmental elements that made participants unconsciously view staff as scientific authorities. For instance, conducting it at Yale University's psychology lab lent inherent authority to the setting. When participants arrived, the staff's coordinated uniforms and sophisticated lab equipment created mystique, reinforcing belief in their scientific authority. Once you perceive someone as an authority, saying no becomes incredibly difficult. Have you ever experienced this? Your boss orders something you hate doing. You know it'll backfire, want to refuse, but can't utter no, ending up grudgingly complying. Why? Why can't you act on your conviction despite knowing you should refuse? Ultimately, obeying authority. Milgram explained that in the agentic state, people derive self-worth from the authority's perspective, meaning your value isn't self-determined, but defined by your superior's evaluation. Thus, pleasing your boss becomes your duty. Disappointing them means you're worthless, a failure. This psychology makes people exhibit traits absent when alone. First trait. Once viewing someone as authority, you strive to impress them and maintain good relations. In this experiment, participants faced pressure from two sides: the experimenter demanding they continue, and the student's agonized pleas for help. Since they viewed the scientist as a scientific authority, they didn't want to disappoint him, hoping to satisfy him and leave a good impression. Thus, they became hyper-aware of the scientist's attitudes. If the scientist wanted them to continue, they continued. As for the screaming student opposite, lacking authority's halo, their pleas were ignored. This phenomenon is common in daily life too. For example, in corporate meetings, subordinates obsess over the chairman's every word and glance. If a low-ranking person suggests something, many might disregard it. But if the chairman proposes it, subordinates enthusiastically endorse it. This too stems from wanting to maintain good relations with authority, not wanting to disappoint superiors. The second trait, people feel responsible to superiors, but not for the order's content, meaning whatever my boss orders, I should do. Even ordering me to hit someone, I should comply. But I'm not responsible for the hitting itself, because it wasn't my choice. The boss ordered it, so he bears responsibility. This psychology is called responsibility transfer. For instance, a 35-year-old Black worker participated in the obedience experiment. Hearing the victim protest, he asked staff if they should stop. Told to continue, he persisted to the end. 450 volts. Post-experiment, staff interviewed him about his experience. He said he always believed staff's assurance. Shocks cause no permanent damage. When asked who bore responsibility for the victim's suffering, he felt experiment staff held most accountability. Secondarily, the victim, the shocked student, also shared responsibility, because by agreeing to participate, he must accept the outcome. The worker believed he had minimal responsibility since he was just following orders. All right, I just explained why people obey. Simply put, human society needs authority for more effective coordinated action. And obedience to authority is gradually learned through socialization from childhood. Once viewing someone as authority, people let it define their self-worth, seeking approval and good impressions. Thus, resistance becomes difficult. Acting under orders makes people feel unaccountable. Responsibility lies with leaders. This makes obedience sound like an inescapable human duty. But as I said earlier, Milgram's 19 experiment groups showed huge variations. In some contexts, people refused authority easily. In others, refusal proved extremely hard. So what factors influence experimental outcomes? This brings us to part 3. The first factor affecting behavior is proximity between participant and victim. In the baseline experiment, participant and victim, the student, were in separate rooms. No matter the screams or wall pounding, the victim remained unseen. So Milgram wondered, if people witnessed the victim suffering firsthand, might they show mercy? Thus, they designed another scenario. Participant and victim sharing a room, mere feet apart. The participant could see and hear victim reactions. A seminary professor in this setup adjusted his chair while shocking, watching reactions. When the student erred, he showed reproach. After administering 150 volts, this professor refused to continue. She told staff, "I know continuing is important, but why prioritize experiment over this person's life?" He challenged staff. "Have you checked the victim's condition? What's his physical state? What if he has a weak heart? What if you cause him psychological trauma?" After several refusals, he terminated the experiment, as this participant's case showed. When people witness the victim's painful reactions firsthand, they become more concerned about their physical condition. Experimental results found that compared to the baseline experiment where 62.5% administered the highest punishment, in this scenario, only 40% administered the highest punishment. Of course, this number is still quite high, showing that refusing authority is very difficult. The second factor affecting participants' behavior is their distance from the authority. Milgram's hypothesis was that if the distance between authority and participant increases, the authority's power weakens. In the baseline experiment, the participant and authority stayed in the same room, meaning the authority constantly monitored the participant's actions. In another new scenario, after initial guidance, the authority left the lab and gave commands via phone. Results in this group showed that only 20% administered the highest 450-volt shock. Others dropped out midway. And those who persisted to the end had psychological changes. A 43-year-old named Gino administered the highest shock, but before that, he had requested to stop the experiment 3 times. In a post-experiment interview, he said he was very nervous because the experimenter wasn't in the room. If the victim fainted, it would all be his responsibility. But if the experimenter had been in the same room, he wouldn't have felt that way, as he wouldn't need to take responsibility. When the victim left unharmed, Gino felt relieved. But he said, "If I found him dead, I wouldn't be affected because I was just doing my job." In Gino's case, since authority wasn't present, he feared that authority wouldn't take responsibility for the outcome. As mentioned earlier, when obeying authority, responsibility transfer occurs, meaning authority bears the responsibility instead. The third factor affecting participants' behavior is the identity of this so-called authority. In the cases discussed earlier, the authority's identity was a scientist from Yale University's psychology department. This gives the participant a feeling that the person issuing the commands is a scientific authority. What if the person giving the command isn't a scientist, but an ordinary person? Would the participant still obey commands from an ordinary person? So they designed another scenario. In this scenario, besides the participant, there's a so-called recorder who's also a plant but pretends to be an ordinary participant responsible for recording in this lab. Then the scientist first introduced the experimental steps, but didn't say you need to gradually increase the shock voltage. Then The scientist pretended to suddenly get a call saying, I need to step out. You start on your own. Your actions will be recorded live, and then left. After the scientist left, the recorder stood up enthusiastically and said, Hey, I thought of a way. Whenever the student makes a mistake, you increase the punishment level. Then he insisted on using this method in the experiment, meaning the command content was identical. But the person giving the command changed. Now it's just an ordinary person, not a scientist. What would be the result? The result was that only 20% obeyed this recorder and administered the highest 450-volt shock. It shows people obey not the command itself, but the person issuing it. Okay, above are some environmental factors affecting obedience to authority. For example, your distance from the victim, distance from authority, and the commander's identity, etc. From participants' reactions in these experiments, we see how easily obedience comes, but resistance is incredibly hard. However, when authorities' commands align with your personal morals, obeying is fine. But when authorities' commands violate your conscience, telling you to kill or burn, is there really no way for us to resist then? From Milgram's results, we see that although many obeyed, some refused the authorities' unreasonable demands, using their conscience to judge and terminating the experiment midway. For example, a 32-year-old engineer named Risher participated in the baseline experiment described earlier. The first time he heard the victim complain was at 150 volts. He asked staff what to do next. Told to continue, he complied. But at 255 volts, he turned to staff saying he couldn't continue. Despite staff's assurances of no permanent damage, he refused to proceed. Staff insisted, "You have no choice. You must continue the experiment." He angrily retorted, "I have choices. Why wouldn't I? I came voluntarily, believing I could contribute to research. But if helping means hurting others, I absolutely won't stay." Then he terminated the experiment. Post-experiment, when asked who should bear responsibility, Risher refused to blame the commanding staff, stating, "I take full responsibility." Risher's case shows initial obedience to authority, but ultimately conscience prevailed. So why can some people resist under authority's pressure? This brings us to part 4. Milgram analyzed that some never fully immersed in the authority system, retaining independent judgment. This created intense inner tension when personal values clashed with commands. For example, at 150 volts, Risher felt this tension and paused to question staff. Many participants experience this discomfort during experiments. Thus, people adopt strategies to alleviate this tension. One strategy is avoidance, shifting focus from victim to other matters, like deliberately reading questions louder to drown out screams. Essentially, self-deception. Others ease tension by condemning the victim as foolish, stubborn, and deserving their fate. Like the 35-year-old worker mentioned earlier who believed the victim bore responsibility. Since the victim agreed to participate, they must accept the consequences. The psychological mechanism works like this. If the victim is contemptible or foolish, their suffering feels deserved, absolving my guilt. Yet for some, their moral code clashes violently with authorities' commands. When avoidance strategies fail, rebellion becomes inevitable. Rebels actually experience profound fear throughout, wondering about consequences. Will authority punish me? So initial resistance starts subtly through objections, like asking staff, "Can I stop the experiment now?" Ideally, raising objections leads to resolution. Staff might heed concerns and modify procedures, thus avoiding further complicity. This prevents open defiance, but often objections are ignored. Then rebels escalate. "Force me and I'll refuse and quit." If threats succeed, they escape the dilemma. When threats fail, final rupture becomes necessary. Rebellion is grueling. Few participants persist to this stage. That unlike passive obedience, rebellion is proactive. a willful counterstrike against overwhelming power. Ultimately, rebellion is rare. Most ease moral tension through denial or victim blaming. Only a minority journey toward rebellion. These brave souls may later be hailed as heroes. Yet in that pivotal moment, rebellion exacts painful costs. Because even though he made the morally right choice, it disrupted the social order he was part of. Mm. This leaves many rebels deeply confused, feeling they've betrayed the authorities' trust. Um, all right, that concludes my discussion on Milgram's experiments. The experiments confirm that in groups, people often surrender decision making to authority figures. At that point, personal morals become irrelevant. Duty and obedience take precedence. However, this experiment has faced criticism. For instance, what comparability exists between lab obedience and Nazi Germany's obedience? Milgram himself acknowledged significant differences. First, time span. Sessions lasted an hour versus Nazi rules spanning over a decade, allowing deeper ideological penetration and stronger authority. This made resisting Nazi authority far harder than defying a scientist. But Milgram argued that, despite scale differences, the psychological mechanisms driving obedience remain similar. We see parallels in historical atrocities, subjects transferring responsibility to authority or blaming victims to evade reality. Though TWE ended over 70 years ago and Nazis are history, authority itself endures. Every nation has rulers. Every school, company, even family has its authority figures. Hence, obedience to authority persists. It will continue throughout human history. While Milgram's experiments show how ordinary people obey destructive orders, they also reveal resistance's possibility, judging through conscience, taking responsibility rather than shifting blame. As Mr. Risher, who resisted through willpower, declared, one act is absolutely cowardly, trying to dump responsibility on others. If I now said it's your fault, not mine, I'd see myself as a coward. All right, this concludes our interpretation of obedience to authority. Reading notes are below the audio. We'll see you tomorrow. Oh.